In the vast, electrically lit hall of the Metropole Hotel, there was a silence that only exists in operating rooms or on the edge of an abyss. It was November 1925. Hundreds of eyes followed a short man with a sharp goatee and piercing gaze who was hunched over a black and white board. Opposite him sat Emanuel Lasker himself, the former world champion, a legend, a living monument of intellectual power. The man with the goatee, Nikolai Krylenko, was not a professional grandmaster, but at that moment he felt equal to the gods. He made a pawn move, confident and sharp, as if signing a verdict. In this gesture was his whole essence, the audacity of an amateur who believes that intellect and revolutionary fervor can break any age-old rules, be it the Karo-Khan defense or the foundations of the Russian Empire. For the spectators, it was just a game, entertainment within the framework of the first Moscow International Tournament. But for Nikolai Krylenko, the chessboard was the only place where the world obeyed strict, understandable laws of logic. Outside the walls of the Metropole, a storm raged, which he himself had helped unleash, but which he could no longer control. There, in the corridors of the Kremlin and the headquarters of the Red Army, the rules changed every day, and the pieces on the political board moved not diagonally or vertically, but along trajectories of betrayal and brute force. That evening, he did not yet know that his own game had already entered the middle game, where his position was hopelessly deteriorating, and his opponent was not the noble Lasker, but a faceless, heavy machine that recognized neither rules nor grace. He looked at the wooden figures, seeing in them obedient battalions, but real battalions were already preparing to turn against their creator. To understand the tragedy of this moment, one must rewind the tape of time, to the point where absurdity became reality. The story of Nikolai Krylenko's rise is a story of how a man who had never held anything heavier than a volume of marks and an ice axe became the head of a multi-million army machine. In November 1917, an appointment occurred that old generals perceived as a bad joke. An ensign, merely an ensign, a man with the lowest officer rank, was appointed Supreme Commander-in-Chief of the entire Russian army. This was not just a violation of subordination, it was the destruction of the very idea of military hierarchy. Krylenko accepted this post not as a military strategist, but as an ideologist. His task was not to defeat the enemy on the battlefield in the classical sense, but to dismantle the old army to build something new on its ruins. He waged war not with cannons, but with decrees and speeches. His main weapon was his voice, sharp, convincing, hypnotizing the soldier masses. He called not for obedience, he called for choosing commanders. He turned barracks into discussion clubs. And in this was a grand paradox. The man who most valued the intellectual order of chess became the architect of absolute chaos. He believed that chaos was temporary, that it was only an opening, after which a harmonious game would begin according to new socialist rules. But history is a cruel opponent. It remembers every wrong move. When the old army ceased to exist, there arose a need to create a new one. And it was here that Krylenko's theoretical mind collided with a reality smelling of sweat, makorka, and horse manure. He had to build the Red Army, but he tried to build it according to blueprints that existed only in his head. The conflict that originated in those years matured slowly, like an abscess under thick skin. It was a clash of two worlds, two philosophies. On one side were the intellectual revolutionaries, men of cabinets, émigré libraries, and chess clubs, to whom Krylenko belonged. They saw in the soldier a conscious proletarian, a figure to be enlightened. On the other side rose a new, rough, and formidable force, the konarmaitsi, cavalrymen, men of action, practitioners of hacking and onslaught, personified by Semyon Budyonny and Kliment Voroshilov. For Budyonny, war was not a chess game, but a furious charge, where victory went to the one with the sharper saber and faster horse. Budyonny could barely tolerate Krylenko. For the renowned cavalryman, this small, bustling man in pince-nez, discoursing on lofty matters and constantly distracted by some mountaineering expeditions or chess studies, was a living insult to the military profession. In the headquarters, whispers circulated. The whispers turned into a hum. They said that while the 1st Cavalry was freezing in the steppes, the commander-in-chief was organizing chess clubs and spending precious resources on publishing brochures about the benefits of mountain tourism. This external conflict was merely the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the personal animosity lay a deep chasm between professionalism and amateurism, between practice and bare theory. Krylenko, being a man of incredible energy, tried to be everywhere at once. He established Soviet justice, was a prosecutor, a mountaineer, and a chess organizer simultaneously. And in each of these spheres, he behaved like a player confident in his superiority. But his arrogance, characteristic of many old Bolsheviks, played a cruel trick on him. He didn't notice how the atmosphere in the country had changed. He thought that his status as _quote _2 and his personal acquaintance with the leaders of the revolution served as reliable protection, an impenetrable armor. He allowed himself what others were no longer forgiven for: to argue, to ironize, to place his hobbies above his official duties. His passion for chess was particularly irritating. In a hungry, ruined country where there was a shortage of bread and ammunition, Krylenko obsessively promoted chess as, quote, 3. He spent hours analyzing games when decisions on supplies or personnel issues were expected from him. In the eyes of, quote, 4, like Voroshilov, this looked not just like a whim, but like criminal negligence bordering on sabotage. Quote, 5. This thought, once uttered behind the scenes, became a verdict that had not yet been written down, but was already in the air. Krylenko did not understand that in the new coordinate system, intellectual complexity became a disadvantage, while simplicity and devotion became the main virtues. But the most terrible conflict was unfolding not in the offices of the commissariat, but within Nikolai Vasilyevich's own personality. He was a lawyer, a man of law, and at the same time, he became the chief theoretician and practitioner of revolutionary lawlessness. It was he, acting as prosecutor in the high-profile trials of the early 20s, who justified the principle that the guilt of a specific person is not important. What matters is their class affiliation. He created the monster of expediency, which was supposed to replace the old bourgeois justice. Krylenko, with a glint in his eyes, argued that the court was not the scales of Themis, but an instrument of political struggle. He turned justice into the same chess tournament, where the outcome was predetermined by the player's strength, not by objective truth. He reveled in his power, his voice, sending people into oblivion with the ease of a grandmaster sweeping pieces off the board. But in creating this machine of destruction, he, like many intellectuals of that time, made a fatal logical error. He believed that he himself was the player, the operator of the machine, and that he, the creator of the rules, could not be touched by these rules. He did not take into account that the system of socialist legality he created provided no exceptions. It was a zugzwang, a situation where any move leads to a worsening of the position, but not making moves is impossible. His passion for mountaineering was also part of this inner escape. Mountains, like chess, were pure. There, on the peaks of the Pamirs, where the air was thin and chillingly cold, there were no intrigues, no whispers behind one's back, no dirty political squabbles. Krylenko conquered peaks with the same fanaticism with which he accused __0_. He dragged hundreds of people with him into the mountains, organized mass mountaineering expeditions, believing that mountains tempered the Soviet man. But for his enemies, this was just another proof of his detachment from reality. While he was searching for a path to the summit of Peak Lenin, his opponents were searching for a path to his case in the NKVD archives. The situation began to change by the mid-1930s. The atmosphere in the country thickened. The old guard, intellectuals, those who made the revolution in emigrant cafes, began to get in the way. They were replaced by executors, people without biographies, without superfluous thoughts, but with an absolute readiness to carry out any order. Krylenko, who held the post of People's Commissar of Justice, began to feel the ground slipping from under his feet. His methods, which seemed to him the pinnacle of revolutionary law, suddenly came under criticism. But the criticism was not for cruelty, but for softness and procedural red tape. He was demanded simplification, acceleration, a conveyor belt. And he, despite all his cruelty, remained a lawyer, clinging to certain, albeit perverted, forms. The turning point was Vyshinsky's appointment. Andrei Vyshinsky, a man with the appearance of a professor and the grip of a bulldog, was the complete opposite of Krylenko. If Krylenko was a tribune, a revolutionary romantic of terror, Vyshinsky was a cold technocrat of destruction. An enmity flared up between them. This was not just a struggle for a seat, it was a struggle of species. Vyshinsky despised Krylenko for his, quote, for his hobbies, for his claim to intellectual exclusivity. He methodically collected dossiers, recording every misstep, every tardiness, every chess game during working hours. In 1937, the circle closed. At party plenums, Krylenko began to be openly accused of having ruined the work of the People's Commissariat of Justice. Everything was remembered against him: strange personnel decisions, excessive enthusiasm for tourism at state expense, and, of course, conflicts with the military. Budyonny and Voroshilov had not forgotten the arrogant ensign. Now, as the army was being purged of intellectuals like Tukhachevsky, it was Krylenko's turn. His intellectualism, his knowledge of languages, his broad erudition, everything he was proud of now became evidence. In the eyes of the new authorities, a person who thinks too much and plays complex games was a potential traitor. Krylenko tried to defend himself. He delivered speeches, repented, admitted mistakes, promised to reform. But this was the defense of a player who does not understand that his opponent has overturned the board and is hitting him on the head with it. His logical constructions shattered against a deaf wall of silence or crude laughter. He ceased to be a commissar. He was removed from office, but he was still at large, still hoping that this was a temporary disgrace. He continued to play chess, as if trying to conjure reality, to return it to the channel of logic. In January 1938, the denouement came suddenly and prosaically. The phone call he had awaited and feared every night broke the silence of his apartment. They came for him not as an enemy with whom one fights, but as spent material. The arrest of the first commander-in-chief was not heroic. There was no shootout, no barricades. There were only tired people in caps, a search warrant, and the frightened eyes of his household. He was taken away into the night, to that very building, the foundation of whose power he himself had once laid with his fiery speeches. In the prison cell, the chessboard disappeared. Only the stone floor and endless interrogations remained. The investigators were not interested in his theories of law. They did not need his brilliant oratorical passages. They needed a signature on a confession that he was a spy, a terrorist, a saboteur. What an irony of fate. Nikolai Krylenko, the creator of the theory that a defendant's confession is the queen of evidence, was now experiencing the effectiveness of this method firsthand. He was beaten, not intellectually, in an argument, but physically, crudely, methodically. Those very _quote_0_, whose interests he allegedly defended all his life, were now kicking the spirit out of him with boots and rubber truncheons. He was accused of connections with anti-Soviet organizations, preparing terrorist attacks and sabotage in mountaineering. Even mountains were dragged into the case, claiming that he was preparing bases there for enemies. But the most absurd and at the same time logical accusation was that he deliberately weakened the country's defense capability with his formalism and detachment from reality. His chess laziness was transformed in the case materials into criminal inaction. The old guard of cavalrymen finally won. Intellect was recognized as a hostile element. In these last months of his life, Krylenko probably rethought a lot. Sitting in solitary confinement, deprived of the ability to make a move, he could see the entire game of his life whole. He saw how in the opening of 1917 he sacrificed the pawns of morality and law for the sake of gaining tempo. He saw how in the middle game of the 20s he got carried away with the attack, forgetting about the defense of his own king. And now, in the end game, he found himself in a position where any move leads to checkmate. His faith in reason, in the idea that a system could be built on pure intellect without an ethical foundation, turned out to be an illusion. A system devoid of morality inevitably descends into the law of the strong. And he was not the strong one. The trial lasted only 20 minutes. It was on July 29, 1938. No speeches, no debates, no witnesses. A troika of judges rattling through the indictment. Krylenko stood before them, broken, gaunt, but perhaps somewhere deep down he was assessing what was happening from a professional point of view. He saw that this trial was a farce, a caricature of the justice he once tried, or pretended to try, to create. He himself abolished adversarial proceedings in political trials, and now this abolition struck him. The verdict was the highest measure, the end of life. Execution was immediate. When he was led out of the hall, he did not shout slogans. He understood that the game was over. The Grand Master lost. The intellectual in uniform was crushed by the soldier's boot. His departure marked the final victory of the Stalinist era of simplification. The time of complex people was over. The time of simple solutions, straight lines, and unambiguous orders had come. Chess as a model of state governance was discarded. Only a battle map remained on the table where people were not spared, just as ammunition is not spared. The meaning of Nikolai Krylenko's story goes far beyond the tragedy of one man. It is an eternal lesson for all intellectuals who flirt with power and violence, believing that they can outsmart brute force with their minds. History proves time and again, when an intellectual takes up a sword, he ceases to be an intellectual, but rarely becomes a true warrior. He becomes a hybrid, alien to both sides. For true humanists, he is an executioner who betrayed ideals. For true executioners, he is a weakling who thinks too much. Krylenko forgot that politics is not chess. In chess, all pieces are visible, the rules are immutable, and the opponent respects the code of honor. In the real struggle for power, the board can be overturned at any moment. The rules are written by the victor after the victory, and the pieces can suddenly come alive and stab their player in the back. His disdain for the army, his arrogant attitude towards soldier boys like Budyani, his escape into the world of mountain peaks and chess studies, all of this was an attempt to hide from the terrible reality he himself had created. He wanted to be both a Jacobin and a European intellectual at the same time. But it is impossible to sit on two chairs when the earth is shaking from the march of millions of feet. Today, the name of Nikolai Krylenko is often remembered only in footnotes to history textbooks or in specialized works on the history of chess and mountaineering. But his shadow invisibly stands behind every instance where competence is sacrificed for loyalty, when complex problems are attempted to be solved with simple slogans, when the law becomes an instrument of political reprisal. His fate is a warning that he who creates a machine of terror ultimately falls into its gears himself. The machine knows no gratitude, it has no memory. It operates by an algorithm of destruction, and it doesn't care whose body it grinds, an enemy of the revolution or its first commander-in-chief. Completing this circle, let us mentally return to that hall of the Metropole Hotel. Imagine that the game was not interrupted by history. Krylenko sits at the board, his hand poised over a piece. He calculates variations, searches for a beautiful combination, believes in the power of his mind. But outside, the lights are already going out, and a black car is pulling up to the entrance. And this move, the move of the black car, cannot be parried by either Nimzovich's defense or Evans' gambit. This is a move from another game, a game without rules, where the one who survives wins. And in this game, Nikolai Vasilyevich Krylenko was checkmated, without even having time to understand that his time had run out long before the flag fell on the chess clock. He remained in history as a symbol of an era devouring its children, as a grand master who lost the game of his own life.